What do the Billboard charts really represent? How do they figure things? And why did so many classic rock acts get skewered by the Billboard charts? I'll answer that and more in this answer to Robert Fithan's video on the subject on this edition of Off the Charts. Hey VC, TC Kirkham here, the Kirkham Report. Welcome to Off the Charts. And this week, normally I do specific chart stuff, but this week I want to talk about the charts in general. About a month ago, Robert Fithan, who is a well-respected vinyl community member with well over 5,000 subscribers, posted a video in which he took the music industry and Billboard charts to task because all of his favorite classic rock acts like Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Mountain, Pink Floyd, they never hit the Hot 100, or they very rarely hit the top 40. His whole argument was that according to the top 40, Player was a bigger act than Pink Floyd. Well, Robert, who has been a respected radio personality for over 2 decades, mostly in the St. Louis area, skewed his views a little bit, and I want to give you a little bit of background on why he has valid arguments, but they're not really well presented in his video because he deliberately skewed some of the results. His book of choice was Billboard's Top 40 Hits, which is only counts the songs that get to the top 40. And while that's true that many of those acts he talked about didn't make the top 40, there's a specific reason for it, and he didn't really bring it up outside of a few asides in the middle of the video, in the video itself. So I wanted to give you the full argument. He's measuring this on top 40 sales or even Hot 100 sales. The problem is the acts that he listens to, those classic rock acts that have sold millions of copies of records, haven't had a huge success on the Hot 100 because they didn't make one of 2 criteria that the Hot 100 uses. The chart that is considered the hit standard is the Billboard Hot 100. It got its start in the early days of radio as 3 separate charts. There was most played by disc jockeys, most played in jukeboxes, and bestsellers in stores. But as rock and roll started to take over the airwaves, and with the growing popularity of the still then new 7-inch single, commonly known to most people as a 45, Billboard decided to reconfigure the individual charts into one standard chart that would combine both sales, average sales, radio airplay, and jukebox play. On August 4th, 1958, the Billboard Hot 100 was born. It has been the standard of pop music, there's the key, ever since. The Hot 100 remained more or less static with just a few tweaks and adjustments here and there throughout the following 3 decades, making small tweaks in the percentage and eliminating the jukebox element in the early 70s. From that point on, it relied mostly on sales figures and disc jockey airplay to determine the hits. Billboard's Hot 100 has 2 cardinal rules and has had those rules from its inception throughout the next 4 decades. In order to qualify as a Billboard Hot 100 hit, the song had to be reporting airplay on a tracked radio station. The Hot 100 covered top 40 stations with a small mix of easy listening and variety stations in the mix. And this is the most important part. They had to have a commercially released 7-inch single available in stores for consumers to buy. Because of this rule, a lot of the classic rock songs that Robert brought up didn't make the chart because they weren't released as singles. Rock radio back then, when it was underground and then when it became more mainstream in the 70s and 80s, they don't play singles, they play tracks. And not all the tracks they play are released as 7-inch singles. This is why they didn't chart on the Hot 100. And yet there are plenty of examples of classic rock having Hot 100 hits because Top 40 radio was playing them and because there was a 7-inch single available. You can practically say the Beatles ruled the Hot 100 in the 1960s. There were also big hits from the Doors, Light My Fire, and Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love, both of them top 10 hits because they had a commercially available 7-inch single, and radio, top 40 radio, not rock radio, was giving them solid airplay. That's why they were included in the Hot 100. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that, they were ignored. They weren't ignored. Those albums are huge. And that was also part of it, and I'll get to the album sales in just a minute. Another song that Robert brought up in his video, and he actually brought the reason up as well, but just to clarify, Madonna's Into the Groove from 1985 never hit Billboard's Hot 100. The reason, although it was getting massive airplay and actually finished in the top 5, I believe, on Billboard's what they called the radio monitor at that time, now it's the airplay chart, it was never commercially released as a 7-inch single, only a 12-inch single. At the time, 12-inch singles were mainly aimed at dance clubs and weren't counted by the Hot 100. So that's why Into the Groove, despite massive airplay, never charted on the Hot 100. It wasn't that it wasn't meant to be a hit, it was, but the Hot 100 was only measuring 7-inch singles and radio play at that time, and that's why it didn't make it through. Now, the Hot 100 has been through a lot of tweaks since 1990 started. When the 1990s started, as compact discs started to overtake vinyl in sales, and as radio was playing more and more album tracks because very few of the labels were releasing commercially available singles on vinyl, they continued to release a smaller number on cassette and CD, but they wanted to push the sales of the full albums. Billboard had to make some adjustments. The first adjustment came in the way that they monitored the radio. Now, previously, up to this point throughout time, from 1950s onward, Billboard relied on a panel of somewhere just slightly over 100 top 40 radio stations who would report in on a weekly basis, either by phone or by fax at the time, a list of their songs and the number of plays they got on the radio that week. They were also supplemented by a small number of variety stations. A variety station is a station that plays everything all over the road. Usually it's considered a full service station if they have news. And they also received surveys of the radio airplay from a small number, about 30 I believe, of what were known at the time as easy listening stations or adult contemporary stations. It was the combination of these two that made up the later format known as Hot AC, which isn't as quite as top 40 oriented as top 40, but isn't as mellow as straight AC or easy listening was. These channels were provided to Billboard every week through voice over the phone or through fax, as I said, and it was compiled by hand. That changed in 1991. November 30th, 1991. On that date, Billboard began using the BDS system, originally from SoundScan, now it's run by Nielsen, to electronically track record play at radio stations. From that point on, the radio station had to have a transmitter that transmitted their data automatically to the SoundScan/BDS system, which automatically compiled the number of plays each song got, as well as the title and artist. That would later be factored into the Hot 100. The very next week, the Hot 100 looked like a train wreck. Songs that had been high on the chart fell off. Songs that had been low on the chart jumped up into the top 10. There were all kinds of crazy anomalies between the 2 weeks' worth of charts, but it shook itself out within a couple of weeks. And even though I don't consider SoundScan to be, you had to be, I suppose digital advent was good in that aspect, but sometimes you just need to hear or talk to somebody. By that point, Billboard didn't even need to talk to the radio stations. They were getting everything electronically. It did screw up the chart for a couple of weeks, but not very long. The first number one song to hit number one under the SoundScan BDS system was Set Adrift on Memory Bliss by PM Dawn, which had previously been lower on the Hot 100 and jumped up into the number one spot. They continued to make new changes in the Hot 100 as singles became almost obsolete in the late 90s. In 1998, Billboard had no choice but to revise the chart to include album tracks, thus making it a songs chart rather than a singles chart, because previously it had been a singles chart. It became a true barometer of all music because they also at that time began including the airplay and sales figures from the R&B, country, contemporary Christian, and Latin genres all together on one chart. Those still had their own separate charts, of course. They still had the top R&B tracks and top country tracks and so on and so forth, but those were now figured in to the Hot 100, whereas before those songs had to be being played by a top 40 station to be included in the Hot 100. They went even further as the digital era came in 2000. Let me look at my notes here. In 2005, the Hot 100 was revised again to include information from digital single sales after the launch of the iTunes Store in 2001. It was revised again in 2007 to include streaming and on-demand digital services. And finally, in February 13, it began including YouTube plays. Not YouTube music, but video plays on YouTube. By the end of the decade, the Hot 100 didn't look anything like the classic Hot 100, the one that was used as the basis for American Top 40 with Casey Kasem, and up until 1991, American Top 40 with Shadoe Stevens. After that, the Shadoe Stevens version of AT40 began using the airplay chart. Now, Billboard has a vast variety of charts out there, and the most recent addition, the one that has everybody buzzing, is the Billboard Global 200, the top 200 airplay tracks all over the world. A lot of songs don't make that chart, a lot of songs that don't make the Hot 100 make that chart, and vice versa, because they're not being played in most areas of the United States. Now, I understand Robert's frustration with the fact that Pink Floyd only had 2 top 40 hits in their entire career, while the band Player had 3. Now, that's a little bit skewed, and I can imagine any classic rock fan getting kind of pissed off about that. Player only had 3 or 4 minor hits after Baby Come Back hit number 1 in 1978. And there were other good songs by Player out there, but they weren't as big hits. While Pink Floyd has a whole collection of staples that are known by their fans in addition to their albums, but only 2 Pink Floyd songs ever hit the Billboard Top 40. That was Money, which went to number 13 in 1972 or 73, and Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which hit number 1 in 1980. Those both had support from pop radio stations as well as rock radio stations. The pop radio stations, or top 40 radio stations, are the ones that made up the bulk of the reporting, and they still do. The radio airplay is now accounted for 70% of the Hot 100, or 60 to 70%, and the rest is digital. At the time, Billboard had no rock charts, and I agree with Robert that seems to be a major oversight. While all these artists that he mentioned, Jimi Hendrix and Cream and Mountain and all of these harder rock acts that now permeate the sounds of classic rock formats all over the world with classic songs everybody knows, they didn't get much top 40 airplay, and that's why they didn't appear on the Hot 100. But their album sales did do well. The Billboard album chart premiered in the magazine just prior to the advent of rock and roll. It made its debut on January 8, 1955, with just 15 positions. Over the course of the 50s and early 60s, they were divided into several different charts, including separate charts for mono and stereo. but they were combined in the week of August 17th, 1963, when Billboard Top LPs made its debut. It had 150 positions and has been the standard for album sales ever since, currently going under the title the Billboard 200, which was officially crowned the 200 in 1991. Each genre now has its own distinct album charts. They don't have very many positions. I think there's 15 to 20 on each one of them. Although back in the day, the top 200 album chart has never figured in radio play and still doesn't, and neither do the individual album charts, R&B, country, and so on and so forth. It is interesting to point out, though, and Robert brought this up in his video too, that Billboard never had a strict rock chart for anything until 1981. Now, given the proliferation of FM rock stations from the late 1960s through the 1980s, it's very strange that Billboard took so long to introduce the rock tracks charts. When it first debuted, the rock tracks chart was divided into two sections, mainstream rock and alternative rock, and it charted only airplay, not sales, because the airplay was coming from album tracks, not necessarily singles, although it did note in the chart if there was a single available, and some of them, during the 80s at least, there were. But Robert has a good point. Why did Billboard take so long to introduce a rock skewed chart? Who knows? I mean, Billboard is the Bible of the music industry, not just here, but throughout the world in many areas. And while other areas do have their own, hit charts by other, not done by Billboard, Billboard does do charts for various other countries as they report to Billboard. They're not official like they are, like the official charts are in UK or so on and so forth, or the ARIA charts in Australia, but they do chart those countries. It is very interesting that they never had a place for the rock radio tracks to go. The rock radio tracks airplay was never tracked until 1981. And I can understand Robert's frustration at that, because you don't really get a sense of how many of those songs were actually hits, and they were. There's no denying that songs, that didn't make the Hot 100 were honest to goodness hits, but they didn't have singles out. They were just radio hits. And that did spur the sales of the albums, which did count on the top 200 and each genre's album group, except for rock. So why did it take Billboard so long to do a rock tracks chart? The world may never know, but they finally did it in 1981, and it is ongoing today, along with a whole slew of other charts that are now available thanks to the digital streaming era. So I wanted to bring this up because I love Robert's site. He's one of my favorite channels, and I got a kick out of the way that he was complaining, and rightfully so. He made a lot of good points, but he did skew it, sort of, kind of, making the Hot 100 look bad, real bad, and it isn't. It's because many of the artists that he likes never released 7-inch singles and didn't get to, or didn't get top 40 airplay. I mean, like I said, Light My Fire was, I think, a number 3 hit on the Hot 100. Whole Lotta Love hit the top 10, and the Beatles dominated the number 1 spot from 1963 to 1970. So there isn't quite the dearth that Robert claims of hits. They are just the best known hits because those are the only ones that Top 40 touched. And Top 40 was the only reporting source, except for those small group of easy listening and variety stations, for that chart. That's the way it was designed. The Billboard Hot 100 is designed for Top 40 radio. It really, and Top 40 sales, not album sales and not album track sales. Now, of course, with the new system where tracks are included since 1998 or whenever that was, 2005, it's not unusual for more rock songs to get on there. And also, beginning in the 1990s, with the advent of SoundScan and the release of singles by mainstream rock acts, you saw the grunge period produce a number of big hits on the singles chart, including Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, which climbed up to the top 10. And yet Nirvana didn't really do that well with other things, even though they did come out as singles, because Top 40 really didn't know how to handle the grunge movement, and only Pearl Jam didn't really get Top 40 airplay except for Last Kiss in the mid-90s. So, yeah, Robert has a point about the rock chart, but not about the Hot 100. The Hot 100 is exactly what it was supposed to be, at least until they completely screwed up the integrity of it when they did the digital systems. Now, if you want real numbers for sales or airplay, you have to look at the separate mainstream retail, mainstream airplay charts. They're not part of the Hot 100 anymore, which has actually benefited me and my Obscuria series, because I've been able to include stuff that didn't hit the Hot 100 but did hit the airplay or mainstream charts. And that's cool too. I wish Joel Whitburn would do a book on just the mainstream and just the airplay charts, the mainstream charts, and the radio monitor stuff. Although the radio and records book is good, Billboard bought radio and records in 2009 and incorporated it into the airplay charts in Billboard. But up to that point, radio and records was a Bible for Top 40 also. And Album Rock has had its own series of charts over the years, published by magazines such as insider industry magazines like the Gavin Report, the Rock Chart Report, and others. So they haven't been completely ignored, but Billboard did kind of not even look at it. And so Robert has a good point there, but I also think Robert's skewed deliberately because he's a classic rock guy. Naughty Robert, shame on you. In any case, that's an explanation as to how the Billboard Hot 100 and the albums chart works. And if you'd like to know more information on this, I'd be happy to give it to you. Leave me a comment down below. And if you agree with Robert's reasonings on this, let me know why. Top 40 radio was never really rock oriented. It was always more toward pop, and that obviously skewed all those acts from about 1965 to 1975 that were making a lot of inroads on progressive rock radio, that never charted on the Top 40, even though Top 40 might play some of the stuff at night. They were playing album tracks. There were a few exceptions in the 70s, bands like Styx and Kansas and Boston, and a few more in the 80s. But a lot of them did get relegated to no charts until the Rock Tracks chart was born in 1981. So he does have some good points there. Robert, please know I love your channel. I'm not doing this as anything except have a little fun with the way you looked at things and let you know how I look at things too. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and please tell people I'm out here. I want to continue to grow my subscriber base, which is growing little bit by little bit, but definitely going up. And please leave a comment. I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say on this and everything else, because it's part of who I am. I'm sorry it took me a month to get this up. Things have been just crazy because I am involved in so much stuff in the spring and summer that it's crazy. I had the American Song Contest and the Eurovision Song Contest coverage here, and I have a lot of other stuff. And of course, all of that stuff is over on my full website, thekirkhamreport.com, and I hope you will check it out. It includes my own personal charts and everything else, and a lot more coming as I continue to revise it for you. Until next time on Off the Charts, hopefully we'll be back to weekly status starting this week. I'm TC Kirkham, the Kirkham Report. Ciao, baby.